Welcome to Off the Clock, the webcast of employment attorneys at Miller Johnson, where we discuss what is happening in the HR world and provide practical insight and advice. We are your co-hosts, Rebecca Strauss and Sarah Willey, two employment lawyers who spend their days guiding employers through all of the challenges that workplaces offer. Good morning, Rebecca.
Hi, Sarah. How are you?
I am so excited to be back recording our podcast. It's been a bit since I've been able to do it because I missed the last few, as you and our audience know.
Yes, you and I have talked, of course.
Yes.
I moved offices. Now we actually share a wall, so we can hear each other even when we don't want to talk to each other. But it's been a while since we got a chance to sit down in a setting like this.
Right.
And we both love it. Should we remind folks about different ways to watch or listen to us?
I think that's a great idea, particularly because this weekend I happen to be doing a lot of driving involving kids and soccer, right? And so I did a lot of listening to podcasts on that. And it reminded me that that's just such a great way to catch up and get content that people want to listen to, right? So just as a reminder, for those of us who are tuning in, listening, paying attention to this, we are accessible through the scheduled webinar of Miller Johnson. We're also on the YouTube channel, but we are also, we've got a podcast.
Yep.
So people can access that through any podcast app, through Apple or whatever. Just search Off the Clock Miller Johnson and you'll find us easily. And if this is one of your first times listening to our episodes, I've got great news for you. You've got like 17 to catch up on. So if you're driving to Florida for spring break, you and your family can...
It is a little jarring, I must say, because I'm a subscriber to our own podcast.
Sure.
You got to always vote for yourselves. And sometimes it's just in the lineup and I don't realize. So when I'm out walking the dogs or running and I get through my other podcast, all of a sudden I hear my voice coming through. And I think, that's not what I want to listen to at all.
No, hopefully others don't feel that way.
Right, for others, when it's not yourself on the podcast, it's very entertaining.
Right.
And yes, you can go take a walk, do what you want, and listen to two friendly lawyers, right, talking about the latest on employment law and HR issues in general.
True to the theme of this podcast, you and I were chatting about some recent challenging situations involving clients, and we stumbled upon a theme that we thought would be really fun to talk about today.
Yes, and not only did we stumble upon it, but after we discussed it, my next two client calls and emails were about this very
and so
topic.
It is, right?
And what I love about it is it's not a specific law we're picking apart and analyzing, because of course that's not how HR works, right? Someone doesn't walk in and say, I have a question for you under this law or that law. They have a problem.
Yes.
So what is a very common problem that is brought to HR? The problem employee. And to be clear, we're not talking about employees who may be engaging in unlawful conduct, right, like unlawful harassment or that sort of thing. And we're not talking about employees with performance issues. We're talking about the employee that I affectionately call the jerk.
Yes.
Right? Just rude, maybe micromanaging, short with people, maybe demeaning in tone, right? Maybe snarky, emails, that sort of thing. Have you ever gotten questions about those types of employees?
Yeah, sure, all the time, right? Particularly when that person happens to maybe be in a leadership role, a supervisor or a manager, and then that will create conflict within that area or department, and even result in employees deciding to leave.
Right. Yes, and in this tight labor market, right, when we talk about retention, everyone's talking about recruiting, of course, but we need to spend equal time talking about retention. There's the great recession that's been happening that people have been talking about. So how do we make sure people are happy and engaged at work? One of the ways not to do that is to make sure they work with the jerk.
Right. I think that's right. And I'll just add too, sometimes the jerk, sometimes it can take a long time for a jerk to sort of fester in a workplace and create a situation that rises to the level so that HR is aware of it.
Right.
Right? I think probably there's a lot of attrition from workplaces, quite honestly, that happen because that individual does not enjoy being at work because there's somebody that they're working with who is being a jerk.
And by the time it comes to me, I don't know if this is your experience too, by the time these situations come across to me, and usually to HR, I think, someone else has bundled somewhere between 20 and 40 problematic emails, messages, anecdotes, because it is a little slippery, right? It's not one thing that is so extraordinary where people immediately go to HR. It's the Chinese water torture. It's the drip, drip, drip of it, right? And so then someone comes to HR and says, for the past 2 years, all of these things have been happening. Is that how it arrives on your desk as well?
Almost always, yes. Yeah. And it's really interesting because I often get the question then from my HR person. So let me say this first. Many workplaces don't have a no jerk policy.
But they should.
They should. We're going to talk about that.
We are going to talk about that.
A no jerk policy. And so lots of HR individuals, when they finally get the concern, right, they pull out the handbook, they pull out the work rules, they think about it, and they just don't see anything objective in those rules.
Nothing seems to fit neatly.
Exactly.
To describe this person's behavior.
And so the context of the phone call I get is often, we can't do anything, right?
Yeah. Yes. So let's talk about all of that. So let's talk about like what we've already touched on all three, but just so we're clear.
Right.
So we don't start chatting, right, and getting off. The three things we should really talk about today when we're talking about the jerk is what types of policies, et cetera, might apply. And if there aren't, can you still do anything? Or do you just have to throw up your hands?
Such a great question.
And say, well, we don't have anything that specifically prohibits what this person is doing. The next thing we can talk about is what are your options once you decide, okay, maybe there is something I can do. Well, what is that something?
Right.
Right? Is it termination? Is it written discipline? Is it something more creative? What are the options? What are all the tools in the toolbox? Right? And then the third is the one that you hit on a few minutes ago, which is really a sticky situation. One, the jerk is a person who is either a high-powered person within the organization or maybe just extraordinarily good at their job, right? So they bring a lot of value to the organization, a top salesperson, a top producer. Maybe they have technical expertise, right, that makes the product, makes your product unique in the marketplace and no one else has that expertise, right? That person just brings that level of value to the organization.
Oh, that's so tough.
Because those are the really tough ones.
Yes,
right?
for the human resources person trying to manage then these legitimate concerns from employees about how they're being treated. And often that's objectively unacceptable.
Right.
It's can be so hard then for to manage that in line with this understanding that they may not have the support from their one up or two up, right, to necessarily fire that person or to recommend that person be fired. So managing that and working through it is really it's important to be strategic. Let's put it that way. So, but let's start at the beginning.
Let's start at the beginning.
Let's start with your first point, because that's usually where the conversation starts, right? So, employee is rude, is demeaning, turns people off. Their communication is
undiplomatic.
Undiplomatic. Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Sure.
To the extent that really, and just as a reminder, right, we all spend more time at work than we do in any other part of our lives.
Right. At least conscious.
Yes. That's true.
We take out the
More waking hours.
More waking hours,
right?
right.
And so when we have employees in a situation in which they feel like they're being treated poorly, in a demeaning way, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah. It will make them want to come to work less.
Yes.
It will make opportunities at other employers more attractive.
It'll probably, they're going to be, they may be less inclined to be invested in their job, right? And in doing what we need them to be doing, or having the level of performance for the company that we would like, et cetera. It's a problem. Okay.
It is a problem.
So with that then, how would you advise HR folks to, number one, handle that if there is currently no written policy in place that's really a good fit for that?
So I love the part after the if there
Yes.
is no policy in place, but let's just assume there's nothing.
And by the way,
For the moment.
assuming this is an at-will employee.
You know, that's a really good point.
Yes.
This whole conversation is assuming at will and private employer.
Yeah,
Right.
for sure. Yeah.
If folks listening have collective bargaining agreements or in the public sector, they probably want to give someone a call,
Yeah.
right, before
Right.
dealing with the jerk.
Correct.
But in a non-union private sector environment, if there's absolutely nothing in writing anywhere in the handbook or policies that applies, you can absolutely still take action.
Yep.
Right? There's no rule in that context that says you have to give fair notice, right, ahead of time.
Sure.
And moreover, any court, judge, your spouse, anyone that hears about this later, right, if the person is truly jerky and there's recorded evidence of that or enough people to substantiate that, people are going to say, yeah, that's fair, right? That's
Sure.
fair that the employer did something in that scenario. When there's not a policy in place ahead of time, that's how I like to think about it. Does this seem fair? Right,
Yes.
to discipline, take action, et cetera, just based on what we know about the world.
So if there's no clear policy or rule in place, I wholly agree with you that sure, we can take action. We're not, at-will employers are not necessarily limited to the list of the work rules in a handbook. However, I would advise HR folks that if that's what they're facing, they're going to need to be very thoughtful about how they articulate the behavior.
Right.
Okay. And I always like to say, use verbs, not nouns. Right? So
Great
instead
point.
of saying, you were ending your employment because you're a jerk.
I'm going to use that someday. now.
Right? Instead, Rebecca, what might they say?
To me, because I'm not a grammar girl,
Right.
separating nouns from verbs, I think about it as drawing a conclusion versus what led to the conclusion.
Sure. That's
So,
another way to put it.
Calling
Yep.
someone a jerk, it's really the same way of, it's a different way of saying the same
Yep.
thing, right? So saying someone is a jerk is a conclusion. But we know that there's evidence, there's conduct that that person engaged in that led HR or coworkers, et cetera, to reach the conclusion that that employee is a jerk,
Yeah.
right? So what are the things that the person did? What did they say, right? And focus on that and not the conclusion or trying to characterize it somehow as jerky behavior or that sort of thing. Focus
Yes.
on what the person actually did.
That's exactly right. And sometimes it can take a little bit of work
Yes.
on the part of HR to help the people, boots on the ground, find the words, find the examples
Yes.
to describe.
Yes,
Right?
I found that particularly difficult in some situations.
Right. This individual talks over everybody in a meeting, for example. Never gives anybody the opportunity to express their viewpoint. Always disagrees no matter what.
Yep.
Condescending behavior, right? So another example is HR might hear Sarah's very condescending, right? And I always say, well, what happened, right? What's the behavior that led them to feel that way? And it can take a little bit of work to dig deeper and
Yes.
find those clues and find those examples. The other thing I will add too is when an employer is making a decision, whether it be a discipline or discharge decision on quote unquote jerky behavior, I almost always then list those behaviors as examples.
Yes, me too.
Don't ever put yourself in a corner to send a message that whatever you're describing in terms of the behavior is everything, right?
Yes.
Here are some examples of what we've seen that's not acceptable.
With the specific examples, not just the behavior.
Yes.
You've engaged in unprofessional conduct. Here are some examples.
Here are some recent
of
examples.
those.
Exactly.
Right. Yes. Don't limit yourself, but
Yeah.
give enough specifics so the person will recognize that those things probably actually did happen.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
All right. Now let's get to the part of your question that was after the if.
Yes.
If there is no policy or statement or handbook statement, et cetera, that applies. I love a good beginning of a handbook, or even
Right.
if it's not in the handbook, a mission statement, a value statement, something that is kind of overarching many, many different areas of the organization's practice, but that talks about respect, right? Integrity.
I've used those a
Those
lot.
sorts of things.
I've used those a lot. And I particularly love it when there's a good mission statement that ties at least in part into how we treat each other.
Yeah.
And then goes on to say everybody who works here is accountable
Yeah.
to that mission statement.
Right.
And I couldn't agree with you more. I've used mission statements, value statements, et cetera, many times in situations like this.
Yes, yes. So if folks don't have those already somewhere on their websites and their handbooks, et cetera, think about it. I think it helps center people too. And it isn't just to create a legal defense, right? I really do think it helps center our leaders and our employees about what we are about and our expectations
And
of
going
each other.
back to that. Yep.
Yep.
Yep. Agreed.
Okay, so there can be policies that do cover general jerkiness, right? Or statements
absolutely.
that can cover it. But if someone doesn't have that in place yet, they can still do something, right? When these people reveal their true colors. As you said, sometimes it takes a little while,
Yeah.
right? But once they reveal their true colors and how difficult they can be to work with, Sarah, what are some of the options people have? Is it just, do I terminate this person's employment?
And the answer to that is quite frankly similar to the answer with any problematic behavior in the workplace, right? Whether it's job and job performance, right? The options are certainly potential termination, discipline, etc. With jerky behavior, I will be honest, I would generally like to see some sort of progressive discipline, some sort of, and I don't mean you can be a jerk 7 times, right? Here's your first verbal warning that you're a jerk, and then here's your written warning, and here's your suspension, etc.
Yeah.
I more mean have we at least had one time out, one conversation with the employee, and set those expectations and explain to that individual how they're behaving in a jerky way, and seeing whether they have the tools to correct their behavior. Okay.
Can we offer some help in that regard? Because oftentimes, as we know, if someone's behaving like that in the workplace, it's probably part of their personality, maybe
Right.
part of whatever's going on in their life right then, right? Emotional issues, et cetera. EAP,
Sure.
right? Might be a nice
Some
option.
EAP programs do have some great options, and I've seen those help. So that's a good resource. I have found myself from time to time Googling personality improvement training. I haven't found that yet, but if the individual is maybe a leader, there are some good leadership training resources out there too.
Executive coaching.
Executive
for instance.
coaching, depending on where they are in the organization. Those could be appropriate tools and options. And particularly with regard to jerky behavior, I always like to explore with the client whether they're in the right job.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
Because there are job positions that require less interaction with others. And sometimes there's a different role for them.
Yes, maybe with less supervision, for
With
instance.
less, meaning they do less supervision.
Yes, yes.
Not less supervision by others, but yes.
Yes, a jerk with less supervisory responsibilities
Yes.
is going to do less damage to the organization.
Right.
Right?
So, and I always like to say, in a perfect world, everyone would be in the job that best suits their strengths, right?
Yes.
And not their weaknesses. Okay?
Exactly.
So if we have an employee that has strengths that they're offering, but one of their weaknesses is interaction with others, I think it's perfectly appropriate to take a step back and say, well, wait a minute, are they just in the wrong role here?
Right.
Is there a role here for them in which they aren't required to interact with others quite as much? Sometimes there are. Sometimes I get laughed at when I propose that, I'll be honest. But I think that's worth having as part of the conversation.
Yeah, I like the idea of offering a potential solution or help for the person, because I think that oftentimes people don't realize their impact on others, the jerks. Sometimes they do, right? There are bullies out there, right? And they know exactly what they're doing. But sometimes people really don't realize that their communication style, that may be very short and direct, may be interpreted by others, right?
Yeah.
As rude or condescending. They just don't know. And so sometimes it helps to have someone from EAP, or there's organizational psychologists, for instance, that can help even mediate disputes maybe between certain teams. They can come in and work with teams in particular, or differences between two individual people, and help them see how their communication actually impacts the other person.
That's such a good point.
Now, this isn't going to be for every employee out there, right? These are probably going to be for higher valued, right, employees who bring significant benefit to the organization. You're going to invest those kinds of resources.
Boy, and not to get in the weeds too much, but I can just off the top of my head think of a few situations in which there was an employee who was viewed as a jerk, largely based on his or her communications. And in those cases, the communications were almost all email in writing.
Oh boy.
Right?
Okay.
So
this was going to be a non-COVID episode, Sarah.
I know.
How you got us into it a little bit.
So
because it's so common now.
It's so common,
people
right?
don't talk because everyone's
exactly.
No one's in the office
And
together.
so there really are opportunities for a really great HR person or an outside resource to help an employee understand how their communications are being interpreted,
Right.
and what they might change in order to improve that.
Yep. All right. I want to follow up on one other thing. You said maybe someone's in the wrong position.
Yeah.
What if there's no great position for them at the company, right? It's not working out.
Sure.
Right, at that organization. Do we just call someone in and say, very Donald Trump-like, you're fired, right?
Right.
Is that the only option?
Well, anybody
that
listening
HR
to our
folks
podcast
have?
is probably not doing that, right?
Probably not, but you never know.
Yeah.
But they may say it a little differently. They may say it a little softer. They may have gone through some progressive discipline or warnings ahead of time. But sometimes the person themselves is not happy, right? And maybe that's leading to some of the jerky behavior. They themselves are frustrated.
Sure. Yeah. There can
in
absolutely.
their job.
I agree.
So how
with
can
that.
we help? How can we help them help themselves?
Right.
As I like to say.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful when the decision's been made that employment needs to end, and we convince the employee that they should make that decision themselves, isn't it?
Sometimes that is the right decision for both sides.
And these, yes, and you are absolutely right that, again, these types of situations are sometimes a good opportunity to have a conversation with an employee about whether this really is the right role for them. Yeah. And if not, then how we can help them transition to a different situation in which everybody will be happier.
It doesn't have to be a win-lose situation. It really
Not
can
necessarily.
be. This is going to be better for both.
Yep.
Right.
There are
You
times.
and me.
There are times, yes, when that works. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, and it usually starts with your behavior indicates you're not really happy here, or you're not happy in your role, or you're frustrated quite frequently, and that must be miserable for you, right? I mean, and it is. It is miserable to be unhappy at work,
Yes,
right?
right.
And if that's leading to some of the behavior, we can help clients talk to the employee in a way that helps off-ramp them. It's
Yes.
called, I heard a phrase years ago that I love, it's actually on my bulletin board. It's called positive attrition.
I love that.
Right? So not everything has to be a conflict termination situation. There is a concept
Right.
of positive attrition. Sometimes someone leaving in an organization is actually good for them.
Oh,
and,
man.
and just because it's good for them doesn't mean it can't also be good for the organization.
That's
But
so
if
good.
we go into
Yeah.
it with that frame of mind, first of all, it takes a lot of stress out of it, right, on the HR side, and the whole thing ends up going a lot more smoothly.
That is so good. I really like that. Okay, so let's talk about your third point.
The stickiest
The
point.
stickiest jerk, right? The jerk in the workplace
A sticky
who
jerk.
is creating conflict and dissatisfaction with the people with whom they're working on a daily basis, yet is valuable to the organization.
Yes.
That is such a tough one. And it's particularly tough, in my view, from usually the human resources person, right, is handed that problem and is asked to look into legitimate concerns about how employees are being treated, okay? And that puts the HR person in a really difficult position because he or she does not know really what recourse is available.
Right.
In other words, in a situation like that, I usually ask pretty quickly into the conversation, is the organization going to support firing this person or not? Right? And if the answer is likely not, then our conversation takes a different turn, right? Yeah. And it usually then turns into, okay, then we need to take a step back, HR person, and think about what options we have and put you in a position to deliver options to your one-up so that you can get support for some sort of action going forward.
Yeah. What I like is to see the HR person, I like for the HR folks to see themselves in a role as bridging, advocating for employees and advocating for the business, right? HR is right in the middle of that.
That's such a good
Trying
point.
to do both.
Such a good point.
But oftentimes it's not HR that gets to make, nor should HR get to make, the ultimate decision of how to balance when there's conflict there. When what might be best for the business, let's just take a top salesperson, just because that's the easiest example. Top salesperson, right, whose sales literally help lots of other people maintain their employment, right? You can't make a widget if no one's selling it, right?
Excellent point, yes.
So, I mean, really, so brings lots of value to the organization, but is also a jerk and alienates, right, the rest of the sales force, and maybe there's more attrition, et cetera, et cetera. So which is, how is the business going to balance both of those? It really should be a one-up or an executive or a president or a CEO, right, that makes those difficult balancing decisions when there's pros and cons.
That's
right?
such a good point.
And those
That's
are the kinds of
exactly
decisions that are, that's what separates you from your competitors.
Right.
Right?
I think you're exactly right. Yes. What I don't want to see is somebody disconnect because they assume nothing can be done.
Right. I wouldn't assume that at all.
Because then we lose on both sides, right? We lose for the business and we lose for the employee considerations, right?
Yes.
So instead, we try to put that person in a position to have options.
Exactly.
And then get the support and buy-in from that higher level individual who actually is going to be making a decision.
Present all the options to the one-up, right?
Yes.
We can keep the person, and this will be the consequence, or we can let the person go, and this will be the consequence.
And we can keep the person but require them, for example, to do leadership training or to
Yep.
or to use an EAP resource or change their communication style or hold meetings in different ways,
Right.
right? And I mean, I've seen some businesses keep an individual like that, but continue to get regular input from those in the area about how things are going, and accept suggestions for how things can be improved. So we give those people some buy-in. We send the message that
Yes.
we're listening, and then we're using that information to improve things, et cetera. So we can really help develop those options for that HR person so that they're not in that horrible position of thinking, these are legitimate concerns and I can't do anything about it.
Right. That's a great suggestion of all the creative ways you can manage a high performer who may have jerky tendencies. I'm familiar with one executive coach that actually measures before, middle, and after
Oh, that's
during
so
the
good.
coaching by interviewing superiors and colleagues and the folks that report up to the person
Right.
that they're coaching, so that there's measurable.
That's excellent.
It's measurables, I think,
Yeah,
is the
I
way they
really
would put it,
like
so
that.
that there's actually measurables along the way, which goes along with exactly with what you're saying.
Yeah.
I love that idea.
So there are certainly options.
So there are options for the jerk.
Yes, exactly. Such a great conversation.
Yeah, well, this is something that walks into HR's door all the time.
All the time.
Right.
I think that's right. And maybe to the extent that people are continuing to engage in person more and more, maybe we're just going to keep getting more and more phone calls.
Well, that's a very interesting question, because I think, to your point, as people are remote, right, the communication becomes more and more strained.
Oh, okay.
More often.
Valid point.
So we'll have to wait.
Valid
We'll have to
point.
see how this all
Yep.
plays out and go back a few years and see what the studies show. But I do think a lot of nuance, et cetera, is lost in written communication, and with so many people being remote, right?
That is a great observation.
Or at least partially remote. So as we wrap up today's
right.
episode, we'll give a little teaser for the next, which has to do with, you coined the term a fluid workplace.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Right, where people
Right.
are remote some days, and some days maybe they're not, and what are all the things employers need to do
Yes.
to think about in those situations. So
Yeah.
until then, Sarah,
Have a great day.
thanks, you too.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Rebecca.